So in this video, we're going to talk a little bit about in-season scouting, and I'm just going to share with you some examples, take you through some hunts, and explain to you how I went about scouting during the season. And this is something that I had never done before. But one of the main reasons why I believe it increased my success rate this year in comparison to any other year was the fact that I actually took advantage of the opportunity of scouting during the season. On each hunt, I would always do some type of scouting, whether it was on the way to the stand or whether it was taking advantage of a rainy and very windy day to do some scouting to find a spot and maybe set up later that afternoon or set me up for a hunt the following day. But prior to starting this hunting challenge, meaning before the season, there are three primary obstacles that I had to overcome from the past, and I had to realize that it's okay to take my time when going out to the stand. In the past, I felt like I had to get out of the truck and get to my stand in fear of missing that buck or doe walking by my stand. I had to learn that it's okay that if I have an idea or a plan to go to this particular area, it's okay to bail on that plan if there's no sign around or anything like that. It's okay to back out and go find fresh sign. But the biggest challenge that, and it really relates to the other two, is that I had to become okay with spooking deer. Not that I wanted to, it wasn't my goal, but what I learned throughout the season that if you spook a deer on entrance, the chances are they will come back even as soon as that afternoon or certainly the next day. However, if you continue to do that, they wouldn't be coming back, they would leave the woods. Most hunters do a really good job of scouting before the season, early spring, even late winter, early spring, early summer. And I do that myself. I do trail cameras. During the summer, I'll do some road scouting to see what's going on, and all this in a hope to get the pattern of the deer down. But what I noticed from my spring scouting was that the deer were and I ran cameras from March all the way through the end of April, that the deer were congregating, if you will, in a very thick piece of the woods. But in summer, they had moved to the opposite side of the farm and were frequenting the soybean field that was planted in the summer. I learned quickly already that deer are constantly changing their patterns and changing their behavior. To break this down, we're going to break it into 4 phases. There's early season, mid-season, rut, which is all phases of the rut, and then late season. The early season for me started on September 14th and it goes until about September 27th. Now, that 2.5 week period for us in New Jersey is called earn a buck. You have to first shoot a doe before you can harvest a buck. And my first hunt was, I believe, on September 18th. And when I went out to go hunt, my only entrance is the field. So I went through the field, and as I was going through the field, I tried to use ridges to, kind of keep my profile down. And as I got closer to the field on the downward slope of a hill, I began to notice how the soybeans were being mauled, but they weren't being mauled on the top of the hill. And as I took a couple steps closer, then I ended up spooking a doe, being she was bedded on the side right off the edge of the field. So what I ended up doing was I went 50 yards on the downwind side of her and set up. Maybe I had a chance of seeing one, but for the most part, it was just going to become an observation point or an observation hunt to set me up for better success on the next hunt. And ultimately, that doe came right back out for where she entered in. Maybe about an hour later, she was out in the field along with some other deer. Leaving that night, walking out with my lamp. I use a lamp, and we can have discussions on whether to use red lamps or bright lamps. I want to see, I'm going to see. That's who I am. That's what I'm going to do. But as I was leaving the field, I noticed a herd of deer. I saw the glowing of their eyes in this particular point. So I just kind of made a mental note of that. But my plan for the next hunt, after seeing that doe leave and go enter into the other side of the woods, that's where I was going to set up on the next hunt. I saw many deer during that hunt, even saw an 8-pointer, but I couldn't shoot it because it was earn a buck. None of the does came into range. On my third hunt, I remembered the fact that I saw the deer on a southwest wind, the deer at night, the glowing eyes collecting, that herd was collecting in this little area before crossing the street to go over to another farm to feed on corn. So on my next hunt, I went in about 200 yards from where I anticipated them coming from to where I saw them at night. Not 15, 20 minutes into that hunt, I ended up harvesting a doe. But what I learned from that, I was able to put the pieces of the puzzle together. I knew that I started to see how deer were moving on wind. I started to see, as I went out, how the soybeans would be mauled. I started to recognize fresh droppings, fresh tracks. And essentially in the early season, that's really all I had to go off of, is where's most of the feeding happening, where is the fresh poop, and where is the fresh tracks. But as we transitioned into the mid-season, now mid-season for me is 9/28 to 10/25. The soybeans in most of the farm are still really good. Although the ones that are exposed to the sun the longest are starting to turn yellow. But there was this one particular area that I wanted to hunt on a southwest wind again, and in this area the soybeans were still really good. And as I got closer to the area where I wanted to hunt, there's about a 50-foot slow drop. It's flat here in New Jersey, so it's a southwest wind, and I wanted to get on the leeward side of that 50-foot slope because most action of feeding was being done on parts of the field that were at the bottoms of these slopes or alongside these slopes. They weren't at the top. And as I approached this area, I began to see the mauled soybeans, but more importantly, I started to see fresh buck droppings and buck tracks, basically larger tracks. So I found a very heavily used trail and set up for the evening hunt. At the beginning of that hunt, I actually had, this is on October 1st, I actually had one of the helpers from the farm on the other side of the property was out there shooting a gun. I finally made contact with him by waving my hands, and he ended up leaving the field. And it was 30 minutes after that where two bucks entered the field. Now I'm 40 yards off. They entered the field from the opposite side. So right now at this point, they're probably about 150 yards away. I watched them for an hour and a half. This is 30 minutes after somebody was out in the field shooting a gun. So that made me think about spooking deer. That whole type of theory thing was going on. But anyway, for 90 minutes, those two bucks were out there. One buck worked its way up the field. The other buck came right in with about 15 minutes of light left. Came right in on the main trail where I saw the big tracks and where it was being heavily used, and gave me a 16-yard shot. Again, I'm going to be sharing that video. All the videos that I share in this video will be in the description below. You can click on those links. So up until this point, my in-season scouting, like I said, has basically consisted of checking the food sources, looking for fresh tracks and fresh droppings. I really hadn't seen any scrapes or rubs, but keep in mind, this was my fourth sit. So 2 out of my 4 sits have resulted in harvesting. The first one was a doe, and then on the October 1st was a buck. And mind you, that was the first buck that I've shot in 16 years with a bow. So I was pumped. So really at this point, I really haven't been in the woods that much to see the scouting. Again, I'm doing most of my scouting when I go out hunting. But then as we approach into the rut phases, my time in the stand went up a tremendous amount of bit. In years past, I always looked forward to the rut, and I was looking forward to the rut now, and I'll always continue to look forward to the rut. But what I realized this year is that I'm more of the type of person that wants to be able to pattern deer, like patterning deer in the early season and patterning deer later in the season. But during that rut phase, yeah, you see more action. I saw more action. I saw more bucks. But the shot opportunities were far and few between. Nonetheless, during the rut phases of this year, my goal was to find that scrape line, not just any scrape line, but a scrape line along that was in the timber, along thick cover. By this time in the season, I had already seen some scrapes and some rubs along field edges, but a few weeks after I saw that scrape line, I noticed that those scrapes had gone dormant. Now fast forward to November, early November, some of those scrapes were opened back up, and I figured based on the time of year that it is, based on the fact that the soybeans are turning yellow, and now the deer behavior and deer are finding their food in the woods, eating hard mass like acorns, I figured let me go in, get about 100 yards away from that last scrape, so in between bedding and that scrape. So I was probably 100 yards from bedding, and then I was set up 100 yards from the scrape. So it went bedding, my setup, scrape, figuring that as soon as the buck comes out from bedding, he's going to walk by. I was just off of doe bedding, in between a little pinch point on the corner, and sure enough, it happened. It happened early into the sit, maybe about an hour and a half as I was sitting, And unfortunately, it didn't come together. I was at full draw, and I ended up missing that buck, which would have gave me $2, which would have been crazy. That's another video. There's a link for that one too. It was an exciting moment for me, just because it hasn't been until this year where I've actually put a plan together, and the plan has worked, and it's actually worked a couple of times now, and that's exciting to me. So later on, as the rut progressed a little bit, I had the opportunity to take advantage. After I missed that buck, I had the opportunity to take advantage of a very windy day. It was blowing 20, 25 steady with gusts up to 35, 40. So I went out at like noon on a Friday, and my goal on that day was to find that scrape line along thick cover. And ultimately, I did find that scrape line along thick cover, and by the time I found it, it was maybe an hour left of light. So I went ahead and put my saddle in, put my steps up, climbed up, had everything ready to go, and I didn't see anything that night, which I didn't really expect to, because in this area, I don't know what it's like in your area, our deer aren't moving in 20-mile-an-hour winds. They're just not. I haven't seen them. So I ended up setting up and then going out early the next morning, using those couple of hours, 2-3 hours of scouting, just creeping through the woods, almost like still hunting, and just looking for rubs and scrapes and any sign. In that 2 to 3 hour period, I found a decent spot that was right on a scrape line, and I hunted that spot the next morning, and I ended up seeing some action. Now, unfortunately, that morning I saw a handful of does and a buck in the morning hunt, and they took a trail that was about 60 yards in front of me where I couldn't get a shot. So at about 10 o'clock, I got down from my setup, went over to that trail where they were on, and sat, and around 2 o'clock, I had a buck chasing a doe, and come to find out that the trail that they came off of was the trail that I was sitting on, that scrape line trail that I was sitting on in the morning. So if I had stayed in that stand instead of getting down, I possibly would have had a shot. The buck would have stood still long enough, and it was a good 8-pointer. I mean, a good 8-pointer, probably better than the one that I had earlier in the season. So that's kind of how my rut hunting went. I would see them move, I'd make a move, and then they'd move back to a different spot. It was just kind of like tit for tat. It was exciting. That in-season scouting session that I did on that Friday put me in position for the next 2 to 3 hunts to have action and potentially have a shot, but again, it just didn't come together. I actually did an entire mini series called Rut in the World, and that takes us through like every phase of that rut. So you can get a feel for that if you want to check those out too. By the way, if you're liking this video, or if it's being helpful, or if you think it'll help somebody else, I would really appreciate a like on it, or even subscribe to it. And feel free to share it as well with somebody else that you think might benefit from it. So let's talk about late season a little bit. Now for me, late season starts November 25th, and it goes all the way through the end of January. Today is December something, so we're in the middle of the late season. And although some of the does are not yet bred, the deer are becoming more and more nocturnal, primarily due to shotgun season. Our last Saturday, our shotgun season just ended. Now we have a permit shotgun, which is 3 days this week, and then we have days of muzzleloader spread out. So the deer are feeling a lot of pressure, which makes hunting a little bit more difficult. But at the beginning of this late season, it was actually the day before Thanksgiving, I decided, since these deer are getting so nocturnal, I have to get as deep as possible to catch them coming out of their beds. So what I did, I went all the way to the other property line, and I was about 20 yards off of it. And on my way in from this field, the soybeans had been harvested by this point. I saw deep tracks. It was almost like a rut. The trail was so thick, and I was seeing fresh droppings going in. So I just walked this trail all the way to the neighboring, just on our side of the neighboring property. And I ended up seeing 3 trails come together at one point. And I got into a tree with my saddle, got into a tree right there. And with about an hour, 15, hour and 20 minutes or so, several does started coming to me. I had a good wind, and I ended up getting a shot and making contact. It was a bad shot, unfortunately. I hit liver and gut, so what I thought, and couldn't find the doe. I thought it was a doe. Ultimately, it ended up being a button buck, but unfortunately, I didn't feel real good about that. But the cool part about this hunt was not only that, I put the plan together once again and it worked, but the cool part about this hunt was that the next morning, Thanksgiving morning, I got my daughter involved for the first time to help me track the deer. And the cherry on top was the fact that she actually found the deer. So that's that was a pretty special moment for her and I. She said it was a special moment. It definitely was a special moment for me. Although the number of times I'll be able to hunt from now till the end of January, those numbers are declining just because of the season. I won't be able to get out as much. But when I do, I will use in-season scouting to help increase my odds. I anticipate the deer getting back into a bed to feed pattern. Food's becoming their number one priority. Other than, security or surviving, they have to have food right now to survive. They just came off a rigorous rut. They've been running all the time from the pressure from the hunter, so they need food. I need to find food adjacent to bedding that will increase my odds of seeing a mature buck or doe get out of bedding and feed on the hard mass. I have a couple of places in mind where I want to go throughout this late season. One is where I had the trail cameras up, where after all the season was over, after all the pressure was happening, they kind of collected in this real thick area. I just need to find the wind and where the food is, and I'll be sure to check that area. The other area that I want to check out is where that buck on 10-1 on October 1st that I harvested. I want to go over across the field where he and the other buck came out of and check that area out. A buddy of mine, Randy, that I hunt this farm with, just a few days ago, saw 3 bucks together. All of them were shooters. He said one was a really, really good one going into that area. So as I go out, I'm going to continue to do in-season scouting, and if these areas don't look good, I see no fresh sign, I'm certainly going to go try another part of the woods. I am going to try to cover this to provide some content. Dude, drop some comments, man. Let me know what you do during the season. This is really just a community to help encourage new hunters, to help encourage hunters that maybe are coming back like me. I was off for 12 years just because of some crazy life things happened to me. And it's for hunters that are ready to throw in the towel. But before they do, I just want to encourage you to try some of these things. So if you're that person, if you know somebody that is any one of those 3, share this video. Tell them to check it out. But if you're a more seasoned hunter, give us your comments, man. Anything you can do to help us create a community that enhances the hunting experience and gets more people to buy licenses. The number of licenses sold in the last 4 years has dropped so much that it's really sad. Like, we're all passionate about this. Why isn't everybody else? So with that, see y'all.